Nearly 4 years after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the president of the war-torn country, insists his side is not losing the war. Speaking to foreign media ahead of the grim anniversary, Zelenskyy said U.S. brokered talks in Geneva had made progress on military issues, but left the question of territory unresolved. He added that if the talks led to a ceasefire, the United States would play a key role in monitoring any agreement.
All three sides acknowledged that if there is an end to the war, if there is a ceasefire, then monitoring of the ceasefire will primarily be carried out by the Americans. They will take the lead in this area.
Alexander Lord is the lead Europe-Eurasia analyst at the strategic consultancy firm Sibylline. Welcome to DW. Now, I want to start with a comment President Zelenskyy made today about the negotiation process. He said that the U.S. would play a leading role in monitoring an eventual ceasefire. Is that a good signal? Could we be approaching some sort of breakthrough here?
I think it's good progress. It's a good indication that talks are continuing, that technical discussions are happening. But in many ways, discussing and agreeing on a technical enforcement of a ceasefire, in many ways, that's the easy part, because both sides can theoretically discuss how a theoretical ceasefire would be managed, how it would be enforced and viewed. But of course, the much more difficult question is, how do we get to that ceasefire? At this stage of negotiations, both the Russians and the Ukrainians are still pretty far apart on fundamental issues. That means that we're still, in my assessment, quite far away from a workable and stable ceasefire. Of course, we could well see a partial or a temporary ceasefire agreed, but of course, without the underlying political and much more difficult strategic discussions going on, without an agreement at that level, any ceasefire that is agreed, I think, would be highly vulnerable to collapse and violations.
Yeah, let's look at the hard part then. The decision-making processes in Kyiv, Moscow, and Washington. What do you see as the single biggest constraint each of them is facing? And in your assessment, which capital is the most boxed in right now?
So both sides obviously want to get certain things out of the negotiations. Neither side are really going to get the full wish list, as it were. But I think there is one side more than the other that feels a constraint in terms of its room for negotiation, its room for maneuver, and that is Ukraine. At the moment, the position of the Ukrainians on the battlefield is very much on the back foot. So militarily, while the Ukrainians are inflicting significantly high casualties on the Russians, they are still on the back foot. We've seen some localized counterattacks, but nothing in the realm that one would have to expect towards, the Ukrainians being able to dictate terms or even influence them in a significant way. Of course, the wider diplomatic track is also, I think, not really playing in Ukraine's favor at present, given the position of the US administration in Washington. President Trump has indicated very clearly that he wants peace sooner rather than later. There are various negotiations and various tracks ongoing, bilaterally, trilaterally. Most recently, of course, in the last few weeks, we've seen talks in Abu Dhabi, in Geneva. But a lot of the comments coming from the White House have been consistently focused on what the Ukrainians need to do to bring about a peace. So at that stage, I'd say there's a bit more pressure on Zelenskyy in Kyiv than Putin in Moscow.
Yeah, and Donald Trump has also been implying that he thinks that Ukraine is losing this war. Let's listen to a Ukrainian general responding to that.
We are losing territory, yes, but we are very difficult opponents in this war. The price Russia is paying for this war is very high. We may be losing territory, that's true, but we're striking their economy, their manpower, and their equipment. These are very important factors.
Alexander, with Donald Trump back in office, there is a lot of noise, but not much clarity. Do we actually know what he wants from the war in Ukraine? And how is that uncertainty shaping calculations in Kyiv and Moscow?
Well, at a fundamental level, the Trump administration just wants peace in any form quickly. But of course, how we get there is another matter. And it's at that point where the Trump administration, I think, has been frustrated that there hasn't been any progress really in the last sort of year. So it's made it very clear that it wants peace sooner rather than later. Of course, that has likely influenced its decision to influence Kyiv and try to apply pressure on Kyiv, because its ability to pressure Moscow is not quite the same ability. They don't have the same capacity to do that. Of course, there's more that they could do, but this is the strategy. But more broadly, I think what the objective of the Trump administration is, and we've seen this in various other geopolitical flashpoints, negotiations, bilateral agreements, are economic and financial deals. The Trump administration has made it pretty clear that it wants to recalibrate its relationships with all parties across the world to ensure that there is sufficient economic and financial return on any US investment or involvement in any part of the world. And this is no less true in Ukraine. We've already seen negotiations around the minerals deal with Ukraine last year. That's been agreed. Now there are discussions and reports from the Russian negotiating team led by Kirill Dmitriev as the special envoy, that they are proposing some $12 trillion worth of bilateral trade, business deals and investments. These are big. This is big money, much more than the Ukrainians can offer. And I think that is precisely what the Russians are doing. They're attempting to speak in Trump's language, appeal to what the administration wants, which is economic benefit for the US. And given the resource riches of Russia and the way that the Russians do business, that is something that they're trying to appeal to the US to try and essentially influence the decisions being made, and of course move towards a peace deal which is more beneficial to its own interests in Russia rather than in Ukraine. So there's a lot of competing discussions going on here. Both sides understand that economic deals and financial benefit for the US needs to be part of any stable peace deal with US involvement.
Sure. And every year since 2022 has been described as decisive, and every year the war has gone on and it has become more brutal and grueling for the Ukrainian people. Is there anything that truly makes 2026 different, or do we simply have to change the way we think about how this war is going to come to an end eventually?
I think it's an interesting question. There's various scenarios which we can foresee the war evolving, ending, or continuing. And I think one of the key takeaways here is that negotiations are going to be difficult. They are likely to prove protracted. Even if we do make progress towards a ceasefire, that does not necessarily mean that the Russo-Ukrainian war, which it has to be remembered is not 4 years old, it's actually 12 years old, that might not actually come to a definitive end, and that we may just be passing from one phase of this conflict into another, akin to the phase where we saw from the 2014-2015 initial beginning of the Russian intervention, and then again 2022, the full-scale invasion. If neither side are happy with the pace of negotiations and are not ready to concede the necessary concessions to reach a deal, we may well see the war take a different enter a different phase, maybe a lower intensity, where Russia essentially reserves the right not to sign anything, which it considers not to be advantageous enough, and it merely uses the next period of time to reconstitute its military to then start again and attempt to gain more territory, impose a political system in Kyiv, whatever it might want to do in the future. And I think that's why there's a lot of reticence at the moment in Kyiv to agree to concessions without significant security guarantees, which would essentially guarantee or at least heavily mitigate the likelihood of once again another Russian invasion.
Yeah, and many questions remain about what those could look like. That was Alexander Lord at Sibylline. Thanks so much.